The night Olive Covington crawled through the door of the Redemption Creek Community Church, she had exactly 4 cents in her coat pocket, a bruise along her jaw that was turning the color of a summer storm, and no earthly idea what she was going to do next. The town of Redemption Creek, Texas sat at the base of the Guadalupe Mountains like something God had dropped there by accident and never bothered to retrieve. It was 1882, and the Transcontinental Railroad had passed this particular corner of West Texas by without so much as a whistle, leaving Redemption Creek to scratch its living out of cattle drives, a single mercantile, 2 saloons, and the kind of desperate optimism that only people with nowhere else to go tend to carry. The church was the oldest building in town, whitewashed pine planks that had warped in the summer heat and cracked in the winter cold, but the roof held and the pews were solid, and on this particular Thursday night in late October, the door was unlocked. Olive had been walking for 3 days. She had left Harlan Covington's ranch outside of Del Rio before the sun was even a suggestion on the horizon, taking only what she could carry in a flour sack she had emptied in the kitchen before she left. A change of clothes, a small tintype photograph of her mother, a Bible with a broken spine. She had left behind everything else, including her married name, though she knew the law would not see it that way. In 1882, a woman leaving her husband was not something the law spent much time protecting. It was something the law tended to ignore at best and punish at worst. Harlan Covington was not a man anyone in Del Rio would speak badly about to his face. He had money, a big spread, and a handshake that made other men feel like they had been given a gift simply by receiving it. Olive had been 22 years old when she married him 3 years ago, brought to him by an arrangement her uncle had made after her parents died of fever within a week of each other. She had not been asked. She had been informed. And for 3 years she had tried to make the best of a situation that got worse with every season, until the morning she woke up with her ears ringing and her jaw on fire, and realized that if she stayed 1 more week she might not have the strength to leave ever again. So she walked. She walked north and east, following the old Butterfield Overland Mail route where she knew there would be water stations and occasional travelers. She slept in ditches and under mesquite trees. She ate what she had brought, and when that ran out she ate nothing. By the time she reached Redemption Creek, she was running on nothing but sheer will and the cold night air, and when she pushed open the door of that white church and felt the warmth from the small iron stove that the deacon must have banked before leaving, she simply sat down in the nearest pew and let her body make the decision that her mind had been fighting for 3 days. She slept. She did not hear the wind pick up outside, rattling the shuttered windows. She did not hear the coyotes in the distance or the creak of the town settling into the cold night. She did not hear the door of the church open sometime well past midnight, when the moon had climbed so high it was small and pale and offering very little light to see by. But Vernon Barker heard all of those things. Vernon was 30 years old, lean as a fence rail, with hands that had been calloused since he was 12, and a face that the sun had worked on steadily for 18 years of outdoor living. He had ridden into Redemption Creek that afternoon with a cattle drive he was helping push up from the Pecos River Valley, a job he had taken because the foreman, an old man named Cal Dutton who had known Vernon's father, had asked him personal, and Vernon was not the sort of man who said no to people who asked him personal. The drive was camped 2 miles south of town, and Vernon had ridden in to pick up a medicine order for one of the drovers who had taken a fever. He had gotten delayed at the mercantile because the owner, a stout, talkative man named Herschel Greer, had wanted to discuss at length his opinion on the newly formed Texas Rangers' presence in the territory. And Vernon, who was polite to a fault, had stood there and listened until Herschel ran out of steam. By the time Vernon stepped back into the night air with the medicine wrapped in brown paper and tucked under his arm, it was past midnight, and the temperature had dropped to something serious. He was cutting through the gap between the church and the feed store when he saw the church door was not fully latched. The wind was pressing it inward and then pulling it back, creating a slow, rhythmic creak that irritated him on principle. A man who had spent years ensuring animals and equipment and camp gear were properly secured found open doors almost physically uncomfortable. He looped his horse's reins around the hitching post at the side of the church and went up the 2 wooden steps and pushed the door open properly, intending to latch it from the inside and leave through a side door if there was one, or simply make sure the latch was working and pull it shut behind him. He stepped inside and stopped. The iron stove in the corner still had enough heat coming off it to make the air inside the church several degrees warmer than the air outside. The single oil lamp hanging at the front of the church near the pulpit had burned low but had not gone out, and in its amber light Vernon could see the figure in the 3rd pew from the front. A woman, lying on her side with her knees drawn up and a flour sack clutched against her chest like it contained something precious. She was wearing a coat that was not nearly thick enough for the night, and he could see even from the doorway that she was shaking faintly even in sleep, the cold working its way through whatever thin warmth she had managed to gather. Vernon stood there for a long moment, hat in hand, and thought about what to do. He was not the kind of man who made assumptions about people. He had been poor enough in his own youth to know that circumstances could put a person in places they never expected to be. And he had been in enough towns across West Texas to know that a woman sleeping alone in a church at this hour of night had not arrived there by accident or cheerful circumstance. There was something about the way she held that flour sack even in sleep that told him she was holding onto everything she had. He did not wake her. He was a practical man, and practicality told him that waking a woman in distress in the middle of the night in an empty church would do nothing good and might do a great deal of harm. She was warm enough for the moment, or warm enough to sleep, which was the same thing. The stove would hold until morning. He reached up and unfastened his coat, a heavy canvas duster lined with wool that he had owned for 6 years and counted as one of the finest things he possessed. He walked down the aisle, his boots careful and quiet on the floorboards, and he laid the coat over her as gently as he could manage, pulling it up to cover her shoulders and then stepping back to make sure it had draped properly. She did not stir. He stood looking at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, though he would not have been able to say exactly why. She had dark hair that had come partly loose from its pins and fanned out against the wooden pew. Even in the low lamplight, and even with the shadow of a bruise along her jaw that made something hot and quiet rise up in his chest, she was striking in a way that felt completely unrelated to beauty, or maybe was beauty's most honest form. She looked like a person who had been through something and had refused to be broken by it, and Vernon had always had a deep and instinctive respect for that quality in anyone. He turned and went back to the door, and then he stopped. There was a small table just inside the entrance where the deacon left the Sunday programs and a Bible for visitors. On the table was a stub of pencil and a small notepad, the kind used for tallying donations. Vernon picked up the pencil and tore off a clean sheet of paper and thought for a moment about what to write. He wrote 4 words, "You are safe here." He did not sign it. He thought about signing it and then decided that the note was not about him. He folded the paper once and walked back down the aisle and set it on top of the coat where she would see it when she woke. Then he went back to the door, latched it from the inside, found that there was indeed a side door near the choir area, and let himself out into the cold. He rode back to camp thinking about dark hair and a flour sack and a bruise the color of a storm cloud, and he told himself firmly that he would be pulling out with the herd tomorrow morning, and that whatever that woman's story was, it was not his to know. He was wrong about that, but he would not find out for another 12 hours. Olive woke to the sound of a rooster somewhere in the direction of the street, and the smell of cold ash from the iron stove, and something warm and heavy draped over her, that she had not had when she lay down. She blinked and sat up slowly, every muscle in her back and legs registering their complaint about 3 days of hard travel and a church pew as a bed, and she reached up instinctively to touch the coat that had covered her. It was heavy canvas with a wool lining, deep brown, well-made and well-used. She turned it in her hands and saw the folded paper and unfolded it. "You are safe here." She read it twice. Then she read it a third time, and something happened in her chest that she had not expected, which was that her throat tightened and her eyes went hot, because those 4 words were the most straightforward kindness anyone had offered her in longer than she could easily calculate. She had not told anyone she was unsafe. She had not asked for anything. Someone had simply looked at her situation and responded to it with exactly what was needed, and the simplicity of that almost undid her in a way that 3 days of hard walking had not. She pressed the note flat against her knee and folded it carefully and put it in the pocket of her dress, against her chest. She sat there for a while longer in the quiet morning church, and she thought about what she was going to do. The fact was that she had 4 cents, a bruise, and a town she had never been to before. She needed work, she needed a place to stay, and she needed to figure out how long she had before Harlan came looking for her. He would come looking. She was not naive enough to think otherwise. Harlan Covington was a man who treated his possessions with the particular fury of someone who did not like having them removed from his keeping, and in the eyes of the law and of most of the territory, that was precisely what she was. She straightened her hair as best she could, pinned it back, shook out the borrowed coat and folded it over her arm, picked up her flour sack, and walked out of the church into the morning light of Redemption Creek. The town in daylight was small and sun-bleached and full of the ordinary business of a Thursday morning in October. A woman sweeping a porch, 2 men talking over a fence, the smell of coffee and frying bacon drifting from the direction of the hotel. Olive stood on the church steps and took a breath and let the cool air settle her nerves, and then she walked toward the smell of food, because before she could do anything else she needed to eat. The hotel was a 2-story frame building called the Guadalupe House, and the woman behind the front desk was perhaps 50 years old, broad-shouldered, with hair the color of iron and eyes that took stock of Olive in one quick, comprehensive sweep. "Dining room serves breakfast until 8, the woman said. "You got money?" "I have 4 cents, Olive said, which was not the answer she had planned to give but was the one that came out. The woman looked at her for another moment and then said, 4 cents buys you coffee. The rest is on the house, but you are going to sit down and eat properly and not argue with me about it." "Thank you," Olive said, and the tightness came back to her throat again. The woman's name was Marta Hale, and she had run the Guadalupe House for 11 years since her husband died of a snake bite, and she had in those 11 years developed the ability to read a person's situation the way a plainsman reads weather, with accuracy and without sentimentality. She sat Olive down and brought her eggs and bread and coffee, and then sat across from her, and asked her plainly and without cruelty whether she was in trouble and what kind. Olive told her the short version. Not all of it, but enough. Marta was quiet for a moment after that. Then she said, "I need a girl to help with rooms and laundry, room and board included, $1.50 a week." "I will take it," Olive said before the offer was even fully formed. "Good," Marta said. "You start this morning. What's your name?" "Olive," she said and paused and then said, "Olive March." She gave her mother's maiden name because she was done being a Covington. She did not know yet that the coat folded over the chair beside her belonged to a man who was at that moment breaking camp 2 miles south of town and preparing to argue with himself about riding back in on an errand he had no real reason to make. Vernon Barker had, in fact, no reason whatsoever to go back into Redemption Creek that morning. The herd was moving, the drover's fever had broken overnight, and Cal Dutton had made it clear that they were pushing north and wanted to make 12 miles before the heat of the afternoon. Vernon had his own horse, his own gear, and a job that required him to be moving in the opposite direction of town. He still went. He told Cal he had left something at the Mercantile and would catch up within 2 hours, and Cal gave him the look of a man who had known Vernon a long time and suspected there was more to the story, but said nothing except to tell him not to be longer than that or he would dock his pay. Vernon rode back into town at a pace that he refused to call hurrying because he was not hurrying. He was simply riding at an efficient speed, and he tied up at the church and went up the steps and found it empty and swept, the coat gone, the note gone. He stood in the middle of the aisle for a moment, feeling something that he categorized firmly as simple curiosity about whether the woman was all right, which was a perfectly normal human concern and had nothing to do with dark hair or the way she had held that flour sack. He asked around. He was not precisely sure why he was asking around, but he was, and the third person he asked was Herschel Greer, who as previously established knew everything about everyone in Redemption Creek as a matter of personal policy, and who told him that yes, he had seen a young woman this morning, dark-haired, looked like she had walked a distance, going into the Guadalupe house. Vernon went to the Guadalupe house. Marta Hale was behind the front desk again, and she regarded him with the same comprehensive survey she had given Olive. "I am looking for a woman who came in this morning," Vernon said. He held his hat in his hands. "I have several women working here," Marta said pleasantly. "Dark-haired," he said. "She would have come in from the south, possibly." "And what is your interest?" Marta said, her voice still pleasant but with a quality underneath it that indicated she would not be moved by anything less than a satisfactory answer. Vernon thought for a moment and then said, "I left my coat in the church last night. I wanted to make sure she was all right. That is the truth and the whole of it." Marta looked at him for another long moment. "Wait here," she said. She went through a door at the back, and Vernon stood at the desk and turned his hat in his hands and told himself that this was a completely reasonable and normal thing to do, and that he would retrieve his coat and establish that the woman was all right and then leave and catch up with the herd, and that would be the end of it. Olive came through the door behind Marta and stopped when she saw him. He was taller than she had expected, though she realized she had not formed an expectation. He had a straight, honest sort of face, the kind that showed everything it was thinking without appearing to be doing so, and he was holding his hat the way men hold their hats when they are uncertain about something but are trying not to appear that way. He was looking at her with an expression that she could not immediately identify. "You left your coat," she said. "Yes," he said. She had it over her arm still. She had not put it down all morning, though she could not have explained why, and she held it out to him. He took it and then stood there, and she stood there, and Marta made a small sound that might have been the beginning of an excuse to leave them, and then appeared to think better of it and stayed exactly where she was. "You are all right," Vernon said. "It was not quite a question." "I am," she said. "I have work. I have a room." She paused. "Thank you for the coat and the note." Something shifted in his expression. "It was nothing." "It was not nothing," she said quietly and directly, because she was not in a place in her life where she could afford to let honest kindness go unnamed. "It was the kindest thing anyone has done for me in a very long time." He looked at her for another moment and then said, "I am Vernon Barker. I ride with Cal Dutton's outfit. We are moving a herd north." "Olive March," she said, giving him the same name she had given Marta. "Miss March," he said. He seemed to be searching for the next reasonable sentence. "Will you be passing back through Redemption Creek?" she asked, and she was not sure where that came from except that she was asking it and it was already out. He thought for a moment. "The return trip comes back through in about 3 weeks. Cal usually stops here for a day to let the drovers rest." "Then I will see you in 3 weeks," she said, as if that were a perfectly natural conclusion to arrive at, and she turned and went back through the door, and Marta looked at Vernon with an expression of mild amusement and absolute assessment. "Good morning," Marta said. "Ma'am," Vernon said, and put on his hat and left. He rode south to catch the herd, and he made the 12 miles by afternoon, and he spent a significant portion of those 12 miles thinking about a woman named Olive March who had dark hair and 4 cents, and the most direct way of speaking he had ever encountered in a person of either sex. The 3 weeks that followed were for Olive the first taste in 3 years of what it felt like to live without fear of the next moment. Marta Hale ran a tight operation but a fair one, and she had the particular quality of seeing Olive as a person rather than a circumstance, which was more than Olive had had for a long time. The work was hard, carrying water for laundry, making beds, sweeping rooms, helping in the kitchen when the cook, an elderly Mexican man named Señor Palacios who had cooked for the hotel since before Marta owned it, was short-handed. But hard work had never frightened Olive, and there was a quiet satisfaction in tasks that began and ended and could be examined at their completion and found properly done. She slept in a small room on the second floor that looked out over the main street, and she lay in her narrow bed each night and listened to the sounds of Redemption Creek settling into darkness and tried to decide how she felt about her life. It was a complicated calculation. She was safer than she had been. She was not yet free, not in any way the law would recognize, and she knew Harlan was somewhere behind her, even if she could not see him. She had taken to keeping a spare pair of boots under her bed rather than in the wardrobe, an old habit from the last months on the ranch, when she never knew what morning would require her to move quickly. Marta noticed this without commenting on it for 2 weeks, and then one evening she sat down across from Olive in the kitchen after supper and said, "If a man comes looking for you, I would like to know his name." Olive told her. All of it this time, not the short version. Marta listened without interrupting, and when Olive finished, she sat quietly for a moment and then said, "There is a man in this town named Judge Aldous Pruitt who is a personal friend of mine. He has a particular dislike of men who use their legal standing to harm women. He cannot make you free overnight, but he can make certain that if anyone comes to Redemption Creek asking questions, those questions get answered in a very specific way." Olive looked at her across the kitchen table. "Why are you doing this for me?" Marta was quiet for a moment. "Because someone should have done it for me," she said finally, and that was all she said about it, and Olive did not press. The town itself, in those 3 weeks, revealed itself to Olive in the way that small towns do when you are actually living in them, rather than passing through. There was the barber, a wiry, cheerful man named Deke, who cut hair and pulled teeth and seemed equally pleased to do either. There was the blacksmith, a large, quiet man named Josiah who had come west from Tennessee 12 years ago and had a wife named Cordelia who brought him lunch at the forge every day at noon and kissed him on the cheek before she left, which Olive found herself watching with a feeling that was part warmth and part ache. There was the school teacher, a young woman from Ohio named Miss Pratt, who had come to teach and stayed to love the landscape, though she was quietly frustrated that half the children in the territory did not attend school with any regularity. There was Reverend Coles, who ran the church where Olive had slept, a thin, gentle man who told her, when she came to Sunday service and thanked him for leaving the door unlocked, that he left it unlocked every night on purpose because he believed a church that locked its doors at night had misunderstood its purpose. These people became the texture of Olive's days, and for the first time in 3 years she found herself becoming part of a place rather than trapped in one, which were two very different things and required very different postures of the spirit. She also found herself, more often than was strictly necessary, looking down the southern road. Vernon Barker came back to Redemption Creek on a Tuesday, 3 weeks and 2 days after he had ridden out. Olive was carrying a basket of clean linens up the back stairs of the Guadalupe house when she heard the sound of horses and drovers coming into town from the south, and she went to the window at the top of the stairs and looked out. She saw him immediately. She was not sure if that was because she had been looking for him, or because he was simply the kind of person you see first in a crowd, tall in the saddle, his replaced coat visible from here, and then she turned firmly away from the window and finished carrying the linens to the room at the end of the hall and put them away with precision. He came to the hotel for supper, which was not remarkable since the Guadalupe house served the best supper in Redemption Creek, and half the drovers would have known that. What was remarkable was that, when Marta seated him at a table near the window and Olive came out of the kitchen carrying a tray of food for the neighboring table. He saw her before she saw him, and he stood up from his chair. Men in 1882 stood when ladies entered a room. That was not unusual. What was unusual was the way Vernon Barker stood, which was immediate and entirely natural, as if he simply could not remain seated when she came into the room, and as if this was not a matter of social convention but of personal necessity. Olive set her tray down and turned and saw him and felt something move through her chest that was not fear, which was such an uncommon experience that she stood there for a moment simply identifying it. "Miss March," he said. "Mr. Barker," she said. "You came back." "I said I would pass through," he said. "You did," she said. There was a moment during which the sounds of the dining room continued around them. Other drovers talking, cutlery, someone laughing near the door, and neither of them spoke because they were both doing the complicated internal work of figuring out what this was. "I would like to talk with you," Vernon said, "if that is agreeable. If you have time this evening after your work." She considered it for exactly 1 second. "I do." She brought him his supper herself, which was not technically her table to serve but which she handled by the simple method of bringing it and not explaining herself to anyone. He ate and she worked, and the dining room filled and then emptied, and then it was 8 o'clock, and the kitchen was clean, and Marta, who had been observing all of this with the expression of someone watching a play unfold exactly as expected, told Olive that she was done for the evening. They sat on the front porch of the Guadalupe house, Olive on the bench and Vernon in a chair he had angled to face her, and the night air had the particular quality of late October in West Texas, cold and clear and smelling of dust and cedar, and the stars were absurd in their abundance. She told him more than she had told Marta. She was not entirely sure why, except that something about the way he listened made it easy. He did not try to fix things as she was telling them. He did not offer opinions. He was just there, entirely present, and he listened to her talk about Del Rio and her parents and her uncle and Harlan Covington, and 3 days of walking, and his face showed everything it was thinking without appearing to be doing so, and what it was thinking was a kind of careful, controlled anger on her behalf and a kind of careful, controlled care that he was clearly not entirely sure what to do with. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You walked 3 days alone." "Yes," she said. "You are the bravest person I have met in recent memory," he said, and he said it so plainly that it was clearly not intended as flattery but as simple observation, which made it more powerful than flattery would have been. "I do not feel brave," she said. "I feel like someone who ran because the alternative was worse." "That is generally what brave looks like from the inside," he said. She looked at him. He was looking back at her, and the lamplight from the hotel window fell across his face, and she thought that she had rarely in her life felt so clearly seen by another person. She told him about the note. She had kept it, she told him, in the pocket of her dress since that morning. He looked at her with an expression that was very quiet and said nothing for a moment. "I did not think you would wake up," he said finally. "I did not want to frighten you." "You could not have," she said, and meant it, and was a little surprised at herself for meaning it. They talked until well past 9, which was longer than either of them had planned. He told her about himself in the same direct, unsentimental way that she had told him about herself. He was from a ranch south of San Angelo, one of 4 brothers. His father had died when he was 19, and he had been riding for other people's outfits since then, saving towards something he had not yet entirely defined except that it involved land and cattle and a place of his own. He was good at what he did. He did not say this boastfully, just factually, in the way a man who has spent years learning a trade speaks about his competence in it. He was leaving again in the morning, he said. Cal Dutton wanted to make the next town by Thursday. She felt the particular quality of disappointment that comes from knowing a good thing is temporary, but being honest enough with yourself to feel it anyway. "Will you come back again?" she asked. "I expect I will find a reason to," he said, and the way he said it, still that plain and direct way, made her understand that he meant it as more than a casual remark. He stood to leave and shook her hand, which in 1882 was not the way men typically said goodbye to women they had been sitting talking to for 2 hours. And she thought that was exactly right, that this was a person who would approach things properly, at the right pace, without assumption. She watched him walk toward the livery, and she went inside and up to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and read the 4 words of his note in the darkness from memory, because she had it memorized by now. "You are safe here." She slept well that night for the second time since she had come to Redemption Creek, and she was beginning to notice a pattern. November came in cold and sharp, and the cattle drive slowed as the weather turned, and then stopped as the passes became uncertain. Olive settled into the rhythm of the Guadalupe house with the thoroughness of someone who was genuinely grateful for solid ground, and applied herself to making herself useful in every way she could discover. She helped Señor Palacios develop a new breakfast menu that brought in more of the townspeople on Sunday mornings. She reorganized the linen closet in a way that saved Marta at least an hour a week in inventory. She started helping Miss Pratt with the school on Wednesday afternoons, when the teacher had her older students and needed someone to work with the younger ones on their letters. These were the things she did. She also, on Sunday afternoons when her work was done, wrote letters. She wrote to Judge Prewitt, whom Marta had introduced her to, about the particulars of her situation. She wrote careful and precise letters that laid out dates and facts, and asked specific questions about what options existed for a woman who had left a marriage and wanted to be legally free of it. Judge Prewitt, who was as Marta had described him, a man of a certain age with a deep personal dislike of injustice that expressed itself in very precise legal language, wrote back equally careful and precise letters. The news was not immediately good. The legal processes available to women in 1882 Texas were slow and uncertain. But they existed, and Judge Prewitt knew how to use them, and he told her that he had already made certain inquiries that had resulted in the establishment of certain facts that would be useful in any proceeding. It was slow, hard work, but it was forward movement, and Olive had learned to treat forward movement, however incremental, as a victory. Vernon came back in late November, and this time he was not passing through with a herd. He arrived on a Saturday afternoon on his own horse with his own gear, and tied up at the Guadalupe house and asked Marta for a room, and Marta gave him one and charged him a fair rate, and told him supper was at 7. He found Olive in the side yard behind the hotel, helping Señor Palacios bring in the last of the herb garden before the hard frost that was coming that night. She was on her knees in the dirt, her sleeves rolled up, her hair escaping its pins as it tended to do by the afternoon, and she looked up when she heard him and went entirely still for a moment. "You are here," she said. "The drive finished early," he said. He was standing at the gate with his hat in his hands again. "I had no plans that pulled me anywhere else." "You rode 4 days to have no plans here instead of somewhere else," she said. "When you put it that way it sounds less logical than it was," he said. She laughed. It was a genuine laugh, the kind that came from somewhere unguarded, and she saw his expression change when he heard it, something warm moving through it that he did not try to conceal. "Come help with the herbs," she said. "If you are going to stand in my garden you can make yourself useful." He put down his hat and came through the gate and knelt in the dirt beside her, and helped bring in the last of the sage and rosemary without being told how or being asked twice. And Señor Palacios watched the two of them with the particular satisfaction of an elderly man who has seen enough of life to know when something good is beginning. Vernon stayed a week. They spent it in the small increments of time that two busy people with no established claim on each other's company can manage. Breakfast in the dining room when her shift started early enough that he was already there. An hour in the evening on the porch when the supper crowd had cleared. A Sunday afternoon walk along the edge of town that was not quite a formal outing, but was too deliberately undertaken to be accidental. He talked about land. He had been looking, he told her, at a piece of ground about 40 miles north of Redemption Creek, in a valley where a seasonal creek ran year-round because of an underground spring. He had passed it on the drive and had stopped and ridden through it on his own time and stood in the middle of it for half an hour thinking about cattle and fencing and a house that was not yet imagined. It needed work, he said. It needed a great deal of work, but the bones of it were right. She listened to him talk about it with the same quality of attention he had given her on the porch the first night, because it seemed to her that when people talked about the things they loved with that kind of quiet certainty, the right thing to do was simply be present for it. "Could you make a living from it?" she asked. "Yes," he said, without hesitation. "It would take 2 years to get it properly running, but yes." "Then you should do it," she said. He looked at her sideways as they walked, just like that. "When you know something is right," she said, "why wait?" He was quiet for a moment and then said, "That is a philosophy I have some respect for." She understood that he was not only talking about the land, and she felt the warmth of that understanding all the way through her, and she let herself feel it fully because she was learning, slowly, that feeling things fully was not the same as being foolish about them. On his last morning, he asked her if he could write to her properly, and she said yes, and he asked for the address of the hotel, which she gave him, and he nodded and put on his hat, and she watched him ride north, and he turned once at the end of the street and looked back, and she was still standing on the porch. The letters that followed were things she kept in a box under her bed. He wrote about the land he was negotiating to buy, a process that involved a retired rancher named Sutton, who was particular about who he sold to and required multiple conversations before he would commit. He wrote about the work of building a cattle operation from the ground up. He wrote about the mountains and the way the light fell across the valley at certain times of day. He did not write in the flowery, elaborate way of the romantic novels of the period, and she was grateful for that, because everything he wrote sounded like him, like a person speaking rather than performing speech. She wrote back about Redemption Creek and the people in it and the school and Senor Palacios's recipes, and the progress of Judge Prewitt's legal proceedings, and occasionally about things that had nothing to do with any of that, observations about the world that she had stored up and had no one to tell them to until now. December came, and with it a development that Olive had been half expecting since she arrived. Harlan Covington rode into Redemption Creek on a cold Wednesday morning with 2 men she did not recognize. She saw him from the second-floor window as she was turning down a room, and the sight of him hit her like cold water, immediate and physical. She stood at the window and made herself breathe and look at him and note the facts. He was here. He had found her. He looked angry in the particular way she knew, which was controlled on the outside and very hot underneath. She went downstairs immediately and found Marta. Marta's response was precise and unhurried. She sent the young man who helped at the desk on an errand to Judge Prewitt's house, which was 2 streets over. She went behind the front desk and adjusted her posture to the particular quality of a proprietor who owns the ground she stands on and knows it. And she told Olive to go to the kitchen and stay there and let her handle the initial conversation. Olive went to the kitchen and Senor Palacios took one look at her face and set down his ladle and positioned himself between her and the back door with the quiet authority of a man who had faced worse things than an angry husband. Harlan came into the hotel, and Olive could hear the conversation from the kitchen even though she could not see it. She heard him ask for his wife, Olive Covington. She heard Marta say, pleasantly and without any apparent strain, that she had no employee by that name, and that the hotel register was private business information that she was not at liberty to share with anyone who was not a duly appointed legal authority. She heard Harlan's voice change quality, the way it did, and she heard him say certain things that she was familiar with hearing. She heard Marta's voice not change quality at all. And then she heard another voice, which was Judge Prewitt's, because he had come with impressive speed for a man of 60, And what Judge Pruitt had to say was measured and legal and very specific, and it had the effect that legal specificity often has on men who are accustomed to operating in a space where no one knows the law better than them. It introduced uncertainty, and uncertainty, in men like Harlan, read as danger. There was more conversation, at lower volume. Then the sound of boots on the porch, then silence. Senor Palacios looked at Olive and said, "I believe the storm has passed around us." She let out a breath. For today. But today was in fact more significant than she knew. Judge Pruitt came into the kitchen 20 minutes later and sat down, and told her what had happened, which was that he had presented Harlan Covington with a formal legal document that he had been preparing for 6 weeks, which outlined in precise and carefully researched detail the grounds for a legal separation under Texas law and the specific nature of the accusations it contained, and the names of the witnesses who were prepared to testify to them. The document was not final. The process was not complete. But the document was real, and it was specific, and it made very clear that if Harlan Covington removed his wife from the town of Redemption Creek by force, there were people in this town who would ensure that the specific contents of that document became very widely known in Del Rio and the surrounding territory. Harlan Covington understood leverage. It was one of the things he was genuinely skilled at. And he understood, looking at that document, that he had walked into a situation where the leverage was not his, and that the cost of pressing his claim in this particular town was going to be higher than he wanted to pay. He left. He would try again through legal channels, Judge Pruitt said, but those were channels that the judge knew better than Harlan's lawyers did, and the process was going to take considerably longer than Harlan expected. And in the meantime, Olive was here and she was working and she had witnesses and she had a judge who had known her for 6 weeks and would testify to her character and the nature of her situation. It was not freedom. Not yet. But it was ground, and Olive had learned to build on whatever ground she had. She wrote to Vernon that evening and told him what had happened. She did not write it in a way that asked for anything. She wrote it as a report of events, because she had found that writing to him felt like telling a person who was worth telling. His response came 9 days later, and it was the longest letter he had yet written. He was angry on her behalf in a way that came through even in his measured, careful handwriting. And then he was practical, asking specific questions about Judge Pruitt and the legal proceedings and what she needed. And then at the end of the letter, in a paragraph that was briefer and quieter than the rest, he said that he intended to come to Redemption Creek as soon as the weather allowed, and that he hoped she would still be willing to see him when he did. She wrote back the same day she received the letter and said she would be. January and February passed in the particular way of West Texas winters, cold and gray, and occasionally punctuated by a blue sky day that was so beautiful it made you forgive everything that came before and after. Olive worked and read and wrote letters, and helped Miss Pratt with the school children, and had long conversations with Marta in the evenings about things that had nothing to do with Harlan Covington or legal proceedings, conversations about books and cooking and the nature of the territory, and what it meant to build a life with your own hands. She realized, during one of those evenings happy. Not the absence of unhappiness, which was what she had been working with for years, but something that had its own presence and weight. She was in a place where people knew her name and meant it kindly when they said it. She had work that mattered. She had a judge fighting on her behalf. She had a man somewhere to the north who wrote her letters that she kept in a box under her bed and occasionally took out and reread for reasons she was not examining very carefully. She was happy, and the happiness was fragile in the way of new things, but it was real. Vernon came in March, as the weather broke. He rode in on a Wednesday, and this time his arrival was different, because he came not with a cattle drive and not on his way somewhere, but on his own, with a specific purpose that he had clearly been deciding how to present for some time. Olive could tell this by the fact that when she came out to meet him in the front yard of the hotel, He was holding his hat in both hands and appeared to be organizing his thoughts with some effort. She let him organize them. She stood on the porch steps and waited. "I bought the land," he said. "The valley with the spring," she said, "from Mr. Sutton. Signed the papers last month," he said. "I have started on the house. It is modest right now, 1 room and a lean-to kitchen, but the bones are right and I know what I am building toward." "That is good news," she said, genuinely pleased. "I came to tell you that," he said. And then he stopped and looked at her with the honest, open expression that showed everything he was thinking, and what it was thinking was something large and complicated that he was working hard to make orderly enough to speak. "I also came because there is something I would like to ask you, and I wanted to ask it in person rather than by letter, because it is the kind of thing that deserves to be asked in person." She held very still on the steps. "I know your situation is not resolved," he said. "I know that Judge Pruitt is still working and that the legal proceedings are still going, and I know that is something I have no ability to accelerate. I understand all of that. But I wanted to tell you, while I was here and while I could say it plainly and you could look at my face when I said it, that I have thought about you every day since November and that I am interested in a future that includes you. Not because you need protection or because your situation requires something. Because you are the most clear-sighted, honest, and altogether remarkable person I have met in 30 years of living, and I would like you to know that I think so." The morning air was very quiet. Someone 2 streets over was driving a wagon, but the sound was distant. Olive looked at him for a long moment and thought about 3 days of walking and a church pew and 4 words on a piece of paper that she had kept in her pocket since October and was in the box under her bed now, but might as well have still been against her chest for how close she carried it. "I think about you every day too," she said, which was the truest thing she could offer him at this particular moment and which she could tell by his expression was received as the significant thing it was intended to be. "I am not asking you to make a decision today," he said. "I am asking you to know where I stand." "I know where you stand," she said. "Good," he said. "Would you like some breakfast?" she said. "Senor Palacios made pan dulce this morning." "I would like that very much," he said. He stayed 4 days, and in those 4 days something settled between them that had been building since October, a comfortable, honest ease that was entirely different from the charged uncertainty of November. They talked about the land and the law and the town and the school and the history of the territory and a dozen other things, and in the evenings on the porch, they sat close enough that their shoulders occasionally touched and neither of them moved away. On the 4th morning he told her he needed to get back to the ranch, that he had a man helping him build and the man needed direction. "I will write," he said. "I will write back," she said. He looked at her for a long moment and then did something that she had not expected, which was that he reached out and very gently took her hand in both of his and held it for a moment. His hands were calloused and warm and careful, and the touch was brief but entirely deliberate, and she felt it all the way through her. "Stay safe, Olive," he said. It was almost the same as the note. She thought he knew that. Spring came fully to Redemption Creek, and with it a letter from Judge Pruitt's legal contact in Austin, a letter that represented 6 months of careful, strategic legal work, which resulted in the granting of a legal separation from Harlan Covington on the grounds of abandonment and cruelty, documented and witnessed, the proceedings completed, and the seal of the state of Texas put on it in April of 1883. Olive sat in Judge Pruitt's office on a Tuesday afternoon and held the document in her hands and read it 3 times, and the judge sat across from her and said nothing and let her read it as many times as she needed. "It is done," she said. "It is done," he confirmed. She had been Olive March in Redemption Creek for 6 months. But in that moment she understood for the first time what it meant to simply be Olive, belonging to no one but herself. She cried briefly, and then stopped, and thanked Judge Pruitt with the particular warmth of someone for whom thanks was genuinely inadequate but who meant it with their whole heart. She shook his hand and walked out into the April afternoon, which was warm and bright and smelled of the desert flowering after the winter rains, and she stood on the boardwalk outside his office and let the sun fall on her face. Then she went and wrote a letter to Vernon. He was at the ranch when the letter came, out in the field checking fence lines with his hired man, a steady young fellow from New Mexico named Archero. And Archero brought the letter out to him when he saw it come and said, with a complete absence of subtlety, that it was from the woman in Redemption Creek, which was how everyone in Vernon's orbit had come to refer to Olive, since he had mentioned her in their conversations approximately 4 times more often than he appeared to realize. Vernon read the letter standing in the middle of a half-built fence line with the April sky enormous above him, and his face showed everything it was thinking. And what it was thinking was a particular quality of joy that is composed equally of the happiness of the present moment, and the recognition that the path ahead is now clear. He finished the fence that afternoon. He did not let joy make him careless about fences. He wrote back that evening, and what he wrote was longer than his usual letters. He told her he was glad beyond expression. He told her about the ranch, which was beginning to take shape in ways he could describe in detail now that there was ground under it, and he described the house he was building, which had gained a second room and a proper porch in the last month. And then at the end, he asked her a question that he had been forming in his mind since March. He asked if she would come and see the valley. He said he understood if she preferred not to. He said he understood if she wanted to stay in Redemption Creek, which had been good to her, or go somewhere else entirely, or do whatever she wished with her freedom, because her freedom was the point, and he would not for anything in the world suggest that she trade one kind of constraint for another. He said all of this carefully and honestly, and then said that he would like her to see it, the valley and the spring and the house that was still mostly bones but had good bones, if she was willing. She read the letter twice, and then went downstairs to find Marta. She found Marta in the linen room, which was organized with the particular precision that Olive's reorganization had enabled, and she told her what the letter said. Marta folded a pillowcase with methodical care and then looked up and said, "What do you want to do?" "I want to go," Olive said. "Then go," Marta said. She paused. "You know your position here is not going anywhere. If you go and decide it is not right, you come back. This is your home too." Olive felt the warmth of that land firmly under her feet. "Thank you, Marta." "Do not thank me," Marta said, and went back to her folding, but there was something in her expression that was entirely pleased. She wrote back to Vernon and said yes. He came to collect her on a Saturday morning in May, which was the most beautiful month West Texas offered, warm and dry with wildflowers running up every hillside and the air tasting of possibility. He arrived with a proper wagon rather than just his horse, and he helped her up onto the seat with the careful respect he applied to everything. And Marta and Señor Palacios and Miss Pratt and Deke the barber, and even Josiah the blacksmith, who had heard about this development from his wife Cordelia, all came out to see her off, and there was a quality to the send-off that made it feel not like a goodbye but like a well-wishing. She had her things in a proper traveling trunk now, not a flour sack. That felt significant. They drove north on the road out of Redemption Creek as the morning warmed, and for a while they talked about nothing consequential, the wildflowers and the condition of the road, and whether the spring would be dry enough to allow good travel. And then gradually the conversation deepened into the same easy, honest quality that their best conversations always had. The kind where you could say what you were actually thinking, and know it would be received with attention and respect. "I am a little frightened," she told him, somewhere in the second hour of driving. "What of?" he said. "Not of you," she said clearly. "Of wanting something this much and it being real. I am not practiced at things I want being real." He was quiet for a moment, watching the road. Then he said, "I understand that. I do not take it lightly that you are here." "I know you do not," she said. "That is partly why I am here." The valley appeared around a bend in the road in the late afternoon, and Olive understood immediately why he had stood in the middle of it for half an hour when he first found it. because it was the kind of landscape that does something to a person's sense of what is possible. A broad, shallow valley with walls of red and ochre stone rising on either side, the creek threading through the bottom of it sparkling in the afternoon light, and in the center of it, beside the largest cottonwood tree Olive had ever seen, a house that was new enough to still smell of cut pine and honest enough in its construction to look like it intended to last. She did not say anything for a moment. She just looked. "It needs more work," Vernon said, with the particular defensiveness of a person showing you something they care about. "It is wonderful," she said, and she meant it, and he heard that she meant it, and his expression did the thing it did when he was moved and was not making a particular effort to conceal it. He helped her down from the wagon and showed her the place with the thoroughness and quiet pride of a man introducing two things he loved, and she walked through the two-room house and out onto the porch and stood looking at the creek and the cottonwood and the stone walls of the valley, and she thought that she had walked 3 days through darkness and slept in a church pew and handed a coat back to a man, and sat on a porch and written letters and fought a legal battle, and all of it, every step, had been movement in a direction she could not have named, but which had brought her here to this valley in this light in this May evening. Vernon stood beside her on the porch and neither of them spoke for a while, and then she turned to him and said, "I think you should kiss me, Vernon Barker." He looked at her for a moment with his honest, open face showing everything it was thinking, and what it was thinking was that he agreed. He kissed her, and it was the kind of kiss that is both the most natural thing in the world and also extraordinary, and she stood on his porch in his valley in the evening light and felt herself entirely, completely, fully herself, belonging only to herself and choosing this freely. He pulled back and looked at her. "I love you," he said, and it came out simply, the way things he meant came out without decoration. "I love you too," she said with the same directness. "I have for some time." "I know," he said. "I did not want to say it before you were free." She looked up at him. "Why?" "Because I did not want you to feel like you had to receive it," he said. "You should have the chance to choose things." She stood for a moment with that, and then she put her hand against his jaw and said, "I am choosing things. I am choosing this." He turned his face slightly and pressed his lips to her palm, and she felt that touch all the way through her in the same way she had felt the touch of his hands in March, warm and careful and entirely real. They spent the next 2 days with Olive sleeping in the house and Vernon in the barn with unquestioned propriety, and they walked the valley, and he showed her the spring, and the place he had in mind for a second corral, and the stretch of creek bank where the grass came in thick enough for grazing even in a dry summer. She had questions, and she asked them, real questions that assumed competence and interest, and he answered them fully and directly, and she could see that he had not been expecting this and was pleased by it. She told him about her mother's family, who had run a small farm in East Texas, and that she knew the practical side of livestock and crop rotation and the management of a kitchen garden, and he listened to her talk about it with the same quality of attention she brought to listening to him, genuine and interested. "I want to say something to you," she said on the second evening, sitting by the creek as the sun went down and the shadows of the canyon walls stretched long across the grass, "and I want to say it clearly so there is no uncertainty." "All right," he said. "I'm not here because I need a place to be," she said. "I had a place. Redemption Creek was a good place and Marta would have kept me there as long as I wanted. I am here because I want to be here with you building this." She gestured at the valley. "I want you to know that because I do not ever want it to seem like gratitude or necessity. It is not either of those things." He looked at her steadily. "I know that," he said. "Good," she said. "I knew it when you walked out to meet me in Redemption Creek and looked at me like you were deciding something rather than like you needed someone to decide for you," he said. "I have always known it." She leaned her head against his shoulder because she could, and because it felt exactly right, and he put his arm around her in the slow, natural way of someone for whom this is the most obvious thing in the world. She went back to Redemption Creek after those 2 days, because they were doing this properly, And he rode with her, and they talked the whole way there about practical things, about the ranch and what she might want to do with herself in a valley 40 miles from town. And she told him she had some ideas, which made him laugh because he had not for a moment doubted it. He spoke with Marta privately when they arrived, and whatever he said to Marta resulted in Marta coming to find Olive afterward with an expression that combined approval and considerable satisfaction, and saying only, "He is a good man, that one." "I know," Olive said. "He has very nice manners," Marta said, which was not precisely what she meant but was her way of saying a great many things at once. The courtship, if it could be called that, which was a slightly inadequate word for something that was more like a very deliberate and fully conscious joining of two lives that were already substantially developed and reasonably certain of themselves, continued through the late spring and into summer. Vernon came to Redemption Creek twice more. Olive went to the valley twice more. They wrote letters in between that grew increasingly comfortable and occasionally made each of them laugh, which Olive considered a significant indicator of something important. In July, Vernon came to Redemption Creek and asked her to marry him. He did not do it dramatically. He did it on the porch of the Guadalupe house on a Tuesday evening, the same porch where they had sat the first night and she had told him her story, and he said it directly and without performance, though she could see that he was holding himself very still in the particular way of someone for whom this moment mattered enormously. She said yes. She said it before he had quite finished asking, which made him smile in a way that transformed his whole face. They were married in the Redemption Creek Community Church, the same whitewashed pine building where Olive had slept in a pew on a cold October night 10 months earlier, because when Reverend Coles heard that this was where the story had begun, he said that it was where it ought to continue, and Olive agreed with him completely. The wedding was small and real. Marta was there, and Senor Palacios and Miss Pratt and Judge Pruitt, who had been asked by Olive personally, and who attended with an expression of unmistakable satisfaction. Josiah and Cordelia came, and Deke, and Herschel Greer, who talked to everyone in attendance about the weather and the cattle market, and managed to do it in a way that was, for once, completely appropriate to the occasion. Cal Dutton came because Vernon had written to him, and the old foreman sat in the second pew and looked at the ceiling of the church during the ceremony with the kind of concentrated blankness that men of his particular generation used to conceal the fact that they were moved. Reverend Coles performed the ceremony with a simplicity and warmth that suited them both, and when he said the words that made them husband and wife, Vernon took her hand in both of his, just as he had that March morning on the steps, and she looked at him in the light of the church, and thought that this was what safe actually felt like. Not the absence of danger, but the presence of something real and freely chosen, and entirely your own. He kissed her, and the small gathering of people who had witnessed this made the appropriate sounds, and Senor Palacios, who had brought food because of course he had, produced a wedding breakfast that under the circumstances constituted a genuine feast. They went back to the valley in August. Olive packed her proper trunk and her box of letters and her mother's tintype photograph and her Bible with the broken spine, and she said goodbye to Marta and to Senor Palacios and to Miss Pratt and to the small room on the second floor that had been her first safe harbor. She pressed her hand against the door frame of the room before she left it and felt gratitude move through her like a current. Marta walked her out to the wagon where Vernon waited. "You know where to find me," Marta said. "I do," Olive said. Marta looked at her for a long moment and then did something Olive had not expected, which was that she hugged her, brief and firm and decisive, and then stepped back and addressed Vernon. "You take care of her," she said. "She takes excellent care of herself," Vernon said. "I mostly try to be useful to the enterprise." Marta looked at him and appeared genuinely pleased by this answer. "Good," she said. "Go." They drove north. The valley in August was golden and dry and beautiful, the creek still running from the underground spring even as everything around it went amber and dusty with late summer. The cottonwood threw a pool of shade that covered half the front yard of the house, which had grown since May. Vernon had added a proper second bedroom and widened the porch and started on a root cellar behind the kitchen. And Olive walked through the additions and saw not just what they were, but what they were going to be, which was the kind of looking that is a skill you develop when you have spent time imagining your way forward from difficult circumstances. "The root cellar will need to be finished before October," she said. "I know," he said. "Archero and I can have it done in 2 weeks if the weather holds." "I can help with the carry," she said. "I know that too," he said. She turned and looked at him across the kitchen. "I want to start a kitchen garden on the south side of the house. The sun exposure is right for it. There is good topsoil there," he said. "I noticed it last spring. And I want to talk to Archero about whether his family has any interest in being more permanently situated near the ranch," she said. "If we are growing this place, we will need more hands, and I would prefer hands that have been vouched for." Vernon looked at her with the particular quality of attention that was entirely his own. "I had been thinking the same thing. I was going to raise it with him this week." "Then we are agreed," she said. "We generally are," he said. She crossed the kitchen and put her hand on his chest and looked up at him, and he looked down at her with his honest, open face showing everything it was thinking. And what it was thinking was the same thing it had been thinking for the better part of a year, which was love in its most settled and serious form. "We are going to make something remarkable here," she said. "We already have," he said, and meant several things at once, and she understood all of them. The year that followed was the hardest and most satisfying of Olive's life, which, given the competition for both categories, was not an unremarkable thing to be able to say. Building a working cattle ranch from partial foundations required every skill either of them possessed, and occasionally required them to develop new ones. And they did this together with the same honest, direct approach they brought to everything. Archero and his wife, Maria, who was quiet and capable, and had an opinion on every practical subject that turned out to be worth hearing, came to help for the fall and liked the valley enough to stay. They built a small house on the east side of the property, and Maria's presence transformed certain aspects of the operation in ways that Olive found both useful and genuinely enjoyable, particularly when it came to the kitchen garden, which Maria had strong feelings about and which became, by the following summer, the most productive quarter-acre of ground in the valley. The cattle herd grew slowly and steadily, which was how Vernon had planned it. He was not a man who rushed toward scale. He was a man who built carefully and in proportion to what the land could support, which Olive considered one of his finer qualities. They went to the cattle market in El Paso in October of 1883 and came back with a reasonable return on their first season's herd. And Vernon spread the figures on the kitchen table that evening and showed her where every cent had gone and where every cent would come from next year. And she sat beside him and asked questions and made suggestions, and he listened to them all, and they talked about it for 2 hours and came out of the conversation with a plan that was better than either of them had started with. This was how their life went. It was not without difficulty. A late frost in April of 1884 took most of their kitchen garden, and a particularly dry summer stretched the creek to its thinnest and gave them 3 months of anxiety about the spring that was the heart of the whole operation. A dispute with a neighboring rancher about a shared fence line required 3 separate conversations, and finally the involvement of a county surveyor before it was resolved, and the resolution was not entirely satisfying but was final, which was worth something. The work was endless and physical and demanding, and there were evenings when they sat on the porch in silence because neither of them had the energy for words, and those silences were as comfortable as any conversation they had ever had. And there was joy in it. The specific, rooted joy of building something together, of looking at the end of a hard day at what had been done, and knowing that you did it with your own hands and your own will. Vernon had a way of finding her in the middle of the day, wherever she was in the work, and not saying anything in particular but simply being there for a moment, a hand on her shoulder or a look across the yard, and she understood that this was him doing what the note had said, declaring without drama that she was safe and that he was there, and she received it every time with the same warmth. She wrote to Marta regularly. Marta wrote back. Señor Palacios, she reported, had started training a young woman from town to cook, which Marta said with great dignity was not because she thought he was getting old, but because she believed in succession planning. Miss Pratt had finally managed to establish a regular school schedule for most of the children in the territory, and was inordinately pleased about it. Judge Pruitt, whose health was beginning to show its age, had taken on a young associate who had, according to Marta, the same precise dislike of injustice that the judge had, which meant the tradition would continue. Olive Covington, Marta reported in one letter, had remarried, a development that produced in Olive no particular feeling except a mild and general hope that the woman in question was someone who could protect herself. She said as much to Vernon, who agreed without elaborating, because he was the kind of man who chose his words on certain subjects carefully. In the winter of 1884, Olive realized she was expecting a child. She told Vernon on a Thursday evening after supper, sitting by the fire, simply and directly, which was how she told him things. He was quiet for a moment that she might have misread as anything except that she knew his face too well to misread it. And then he leaned forward and took both her hands and held them, and looked at her with an expression that she had never precisely seen on his face before, which was a quality of wonder that was larger than his usual careful, contained self. "You are sure?" he said. "Yes," she said. He brought her hands up and pressed his lips to them, and then he sat there holding her hands and looking at her, and she looked back at him, and the fire crackled in the grate, and outside the December wind moved through the valley in the way she had come to love, a sound that meant home. "I am going to write to Marta tomorrow," she said. "Please do," he said. "She will want to know." "She will come out here to check on us," Olive predicted. "Good," Vernon said. "I would like that." Their son was born in August of 1885, attended by Maria, who had experience with these matters, and the doctor from Redemption Creek, who made the 40-mile ride in good time when Archero went to fetch him. Vernon spent the hours of waiting doing useful things in the barn, with a quality of focused productivity that Archero recognized as a man who needed to work to prevent himself from climbing the walls. He came inside the moment Maria called him, and he stood in the doorway of the bedroom and looked at Olive holding their newborn son, and the expression on his face was the same quality of wonder he had shown in December, multiplied. "Come here," Olive said. He came to the bed and sat on the edge of it, and she put the baby into his arms, and he held him with the careful precision of a man who has handled fragile things on a ranch and understood what care means. And he looked down at the small, insistently present face of his son and appeared to be entirely beyond speech. "He looks like you," Olive said, "around the forehead." "He looks like himself," Vernon said very quietly. "That too," she agreed. They named him Samuel, for Vernon's father, and Samuel Barker turned out to be a child of particular opinions and impressive lung capacity, who made his presence known in the valley with considerable enthusiasm from his first weeks. He had his father's eyes and his mother's directness, and a disposition that was cheerful by default and stubborn when crossed, which both of his parents recognized as a family trait and handled accordingly. Marta did come out in September for 2 weeks, and she was exactly what Olive had known she would be, which was practically useful, emotionally stalwart, and visibly pleased in a way she expressed through making the household run at an elevated level of efficiency. She held Samuel with the same careful attention she brought to everything, and said, on the morning she left, that he was going to be a fine person and that the credit was entirely ahead of him. Olive stood on the porch and watched Marta's wagon go down the valley road until it turned the bend, and she felt the warmth of love that comes not from romance, but from the specific and irreplaceable quality of a person who chose you and kept choosing you. She turned and went back inside, where Samuel was announcing his opinions and Vernon was in the kitchen making coffee with the focused patience he brought to everything. And she stood in the doorway of her own house in her own valley in the October morning light and understood, in the clearest and most complete way she had yet understood it, that she was entirely, fully, unambiguously at home. The years that settled over the valley after that had the quality of time that is fully lived, which means they were not without hardship or worry, or the ordinary grief of a life in the West Texas Territory in the 1880s, but they had at their center a warmth and a steadiness that held through all of it. A second child came in 1887, a daughter they named Clara, who arrived with her mother's dark hair, and an expression of complete assessment that made everyone who met her laugh because it was so recognizably Olive's. A third came in 1890, another son, James, who was quieter than his siblings and spent his childhood following his father around the ranch with a seriousness that Vernon found deeply touching. The ranch grew, not dramatically, not with the kind of explosive expansion that characterized some of the large operations in the territory, but steadily and in proportion, the way Vernon had always intended it. By 1890, they had a full bunkhouse for the hands, a proper barn, a root cellar that Olive considered one of the finest achievements of the entire enterprise, and a kitchen garden that Maria ran with the authority of a general and the precision of an engineer. They sold to the cattle market in El Paso each fall, and the returns improved every year, and Vernon put a portion of every return back into the land itself, into the fencing and the water management and the soil, because he had always understood that the land was not just the setting for the operation, but the foundation of it. Olive taught the children herself, using every resource she had, the textbooks she ordered from El Paso, the letters she wrote to Miss Pratt asking for curriculum recommendations, and the particular quality of her own mind, which had been reading and thinking and asking questions for as long as she could remember. Samuel went to school in Redemption Creek when he was old enough, and then to San Antonio for further study, which he pursued with the same thoroughness he brought to everything. And Clara followed him, and James, who turned out to have a gift for mathematics that amazed his parents and delighted the aging Judge Pruitt, who met him on a visit to Redemption Creek at age 10 and declared him a natural legal mind. Vernon and Olive still sat on the porch in the evenings when the work was done. They still talked for hours and sat in silence when silence was what the evening required. He still found her in the middle of the day and placed a hand on her shoulder or looked at her across the yard, and she still received it every time with the same warmth, because it still meant the same thing it had always meant. On the evening of their 12th anniversary, which fell in August of 1895, they sat on the porch after supper while the children were inside with the noise and warmth of their particular individual selves, and the valley was amber and gold in the late light, and the creek was audible below them, and the cottonwood threw its shadow long across the yard. Olive had the note. She had taken it out of the box that day, not for the first time over 12 years, and she had it in her hand now, the paper worn thin at the folds, the pencil words faded but entirely legible because she had read them so many times that she would have known them with her eyes closed. Vernon looked at it in her hand and then looked at her. "You kept it," he said. He knew she had kept it. He had known for 12 years. But there was something in his voice when he said it that was the same quality of wonder he always had, as if the fact of it still surprised him. "I kept it the morning I woke up," she said. "I knew before I knew anything else about you that it was worth keeping." He was quiet for a moment. "4 words," he said. "4 words," she agreed. She looked at the note and then folded it carefully and held it in her palm and looked out at the valley that had become, over 12 years, as much a part of her as any place she had ever known, as much a part of her as the church where she had slept and the hotel where she had first felt the ground solidify under her and the road between there, and here that she had traveled so many times in so many ways. "You know what I have thought about," she said, "more times than I can count." "Tell me," he said. I have thought about the fact that you came back, she said. Not just the night in the church because you had no reason to latch a door except decency, but the morning after. You had a herd moving north, you had a job, you had no reason whatsoever to come back to town and ask after me, but you did. He considered this. I needed to know you were all right. Why? She said. He was quiet for a moment. Because something about you, even asleep in a church pew in the middle of the night with a bruise on your jaw and no earthly reason to trust the world, looked like a person worth knowing, he said. I have never been able to explain it more precisely than that. She looked at him in the long August evening light and thought that after 12 years she still felt the same quality of recognition she had felt the first morning on the steps of the Guadalupe house, the sense of a person who would see what was actually there and respond to it with honesty. Vernon Barker, she said. Olive Barker, he said. I love you, she said. I love you, he said, more than I have ever been able to say properly. You say it properly every day, she said. You have always said it properly. He reached over and took her hand in both of his, the way he had done in March of 1883 on the steps of a hotel, and in the church on their wedding day, and 100 times since in ways large and small and entirely ordinary. And he held it, and she let herself be held, and the valley settled into the evening around them, the creek and the cottonwood and the canyon walls going deep red and ochre in the last of the light. Samuel's voice came from inside the house, arguing with Clara about something with the specificity of siblings who have known each other all their lives, and James's quieter voice mediating with the patient thoroughness that made his parents exchange a look. And the sound of it, the noise and warmth and absolute fullness of it, filled the evening air around them. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The note was in her hand, and the valley was around them, and everything that had begun on a cold October night with a flour sack and a borrowed coat and 4 words on a piece of paper had arrived here, to this porch, to this man, to this life that was entirely and completely her own, chosen with her whole heart and built with her own hands in the last gold light of an August evening in the valley of the Spring Creek, in the mountains of West Texas, in the year 1895. You are safe here. She was. She had been, from the morning she first read those words, moving steadily toward the place where they would be permanently true. And now she was here, and here was home. And home was everything she had ever needed and more than she had ever known to hope for. And it was entirely, beautifully, permanently real.